This is your host, Michael Shermer, and you're listening to Science Salon, a series of conversations with leading scientists, scholars, and thinkers about the most important issues of our time.
What a cool course you are taking. Michael sent me the syllabus, and when I saw this section here, the brain is a belief engine. We're looking for patterns. Once we find patterns, we search for confirmatory evidence. This is very much what I do. I've been studying morality, moral psychology, since 1987 when I started graduate school. When I started graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, there was a lot of research on moral psychology, but it was all done from the point of view of studying reasoning, how children develop their reasoning. Lawrence Kohlberg was the leading figure in moral psychology, and he would give children and adolescents dilemmas about should a man steal a drug to save his wife's life, pitting various virtues against each other, and then students would say, the answer always seemed to be yes, he should, and then they would explain their justifications, he would code them. So it was somewhat interesting, but I thought not very interesting. In fact, when I read, I actually found the whole field kind of boring. And it seemed to me that morality is really much more visceral. I grew up with two sisters close to me in age. We fought all the time, as my children do today. They are 8 and 12. And morality just seemed much more passionate than that. And I began looking at the moral emotions. And at the same time, I took a course in cultural psychology, and that blew my mind to read about all these different cultures all around the world, almost all of whom had rules about purity and pollution that were similar to the book of Leviticus and the laws of Manu in Hindu tradition. Like, wow, how do societies that have never met each other, how do they come up with the same, seemingly strange to our modern sensibility, rules about blood and skin lesions and menstruation and what you can eat and how you have sex? Why do most societies regulate this stuff so heavily? That started me searching for the psychological foundations of morality. There must be something in our minds that structure the social world in similar ways. Societies are very different. It's not as though it's just going to come out and bang, there it is. But we're not infinitely creative about morality. There's some structure given beforehand. So that's what I've been studying for my whole career. How did evolution shape us to have certain psychological structures? How do these psychological structures get developed differentially across societies? And then, within societies, why is it that at the time, into the 1990s, that left and right in this country seem to be becoming like two different countries with two different moral worlds, two different economics textbooks, two different American history textbooks, two different climate science textbooks? Like, how did it happen that we're coming apart? This was the 1990s when I started studying it, and man, is it worse now. So I thought what I would do today is I just took a lecture that I gave at Claremont McKenna about a year ago, and the middle part of it is a sort of a summary of moral psychology, very relevant to a lot of the things you're doing in this course. And I'll go through part of it, and we'll just see when it makes sense to stop and open up for discussion. If we do the first two, although actually the last one is most relevant to religion, so we'll see. Let's just start, and we'll see what happens. So. There's this really interesting, I've just been thinking about this a lot. There's this really interesting fact about the origin of our universe. That after the Big Bang, for a couple 100 million years, there was nothing. Or at least there was no matter. There was just energy. And then energy congeals, certain physical properties are such that matter condenses, and we're off to the races, and we get stars, and then that brings us to the present. Stephen Hawking and others before him observed that of the 25 or so major constants of physics, like the charge of an electron or the gravitational constant, there's 25 constants that you learned in physics class. For a few of them, if they were higher or lower by 1 or 2%, that condensation would not have happened. There'd be no matter. We would not be here. That's pretty cool. I mean, what are the odds that things got set just right? And who could have set them? It certainly seems to call out for an intelligent designer who set those conditions just right. And so as Hawking said, the laws of science contain these various fundamental numbers. He says, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. So this suggested to some people that God, the designer, set up the universe, set the constants, and then let it go. Now, many of you have heard this kind of theory before. Who in American history thought that? Who believed that God created the universe like a clock and started it running? Have you heard this idea before? Never heard that.
I don't think we've covered that one yet.
No, I don't expect that. In your high school history, you probably, I was assuming that you did. The founding fathers, many of them were deists. That is, they believed exactly this, that God, because these were men of science, and they were also men of religion. And the way they squared it was, God created this wondrous universe, but my goodness, if we use the right methods, we can find the laws by which it works. God does not make the sun rise, gravity or whatever gravity does, but who set up gravity? So this is a very intuitive way of thinking. The reason I'm starting off this lecture with this is not because I want to talk about whether this is true or not. It's that it makes an amazing metaphor for understanding where we are in this country right now. Here's how it goes. I believe that we lived in the 20th century in what you might call a fine-tuned liberal democracy. Humans are tribal primates. We are primates, very much like other primates. We're different in some ways. But we seem to pretty clearly have evolved for life in small-scale, fission-fusion societies with intense animistic religion. We evolved to make things sacred and worship them. And in the process of worshiping, that binds us together. That's one of the main social functions of religion. So this is a description of the sort of the standard state that human societies have been in for all of the last several 100,000 years until very, very recently. Now, clearly we are able to live in a multi-ethnic, diverse, secular, liberal democracy. It's possible. We did it. We're still kind of doing it. So it's clear that it's possible. But what I'd like to propose to you is that our species is unsuited for life in large, diverse, secular societies. Unless you get certain settings finely adjusted to make possible the development of stable political life. What I'm saying is it is possible for us to live in a successful democracy. Again, we've done it. It's clearly possible. But the margin of error may be very small, and we may be outside of that margin now. As I said, the Founding Fathers thought exactly this way. That's why they were very suspicious of democracy. As James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, because they really read their history. They read everything they could find about previous political arrangements, and they explicitly rejected democracy. They said democracy is a terrible system, by which they meant direct democracy, where everyone comes together to vote on issues and decide policy. Because when you have that, they said, a common passion or interest will be felt by a majority of the whole, and there's nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party. Hence it is, Madison wrote, that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. So they thought long and hard about how to create a system, how to set up this clock so that it would run and not fall apart the way previous democracies had done. And so you might think about the Founding Fathers as the intelligent designers who set up, they gave us a constitution, they thought this all through. It has mechanisms to amend it. It's not fixed in stone. It's supposed to evolve. But they thought long and hard in this deist way about our political universe. How do you create a universe that can last? I don't know about you, but tell me, do you have the sense that things are going well in this country? Do you have a sense when you look ahead at the America that you will run in 30 years or so, do you have a sense of optimism and hope that, wow, things are going to be really much better then? Raise your hand if you have a sense of optimism when you think ahead 30 years to the state of affairs in our country. Okay, a few. Raise your hand if you have a sense of pessimism. You think things might be worse, much worse. Okay. So I share your pessimism. I'm not confident about it, but I am generally pessimistic. The reason is that it wasn't really Madison that... So actually, let me back up. I sort of blew the timing there. So the way I was intending to do this was to say, it's so weird what's happening to our society. It's as though someone reached in and took, say, the gravitational constant. Suppose someone reached in and took the gravitational constant and tripled it. What would happen to the universe? It would spin totally. I mean, it would be a mess. What would happen if somebody reached into our society and took one of the basic constants of social interaction and tripled it? No, multiplied it by 100. Let's connect everybody 100 times more than we were connected 10 years ago. What could go wrong? And so I think now we are living in an age in which technology has allowed certain individuals, again, it's not, I mean, if he didn't come along, someone would have invented something similar. But technology has now changed the fundamental constants of social connectedness in ways that I fear put us now outside the bounds of a sustainable liberal democracy. Again, I'm not confident in that, but I think it's a possibility that I did not think 3 years ago. The way that I felt for the last 2 or 3 years is captured by the poet William Butler Yeats in a famous poem called The Second Coming. He's writing just after the First World War and as the Irish Civil War is beginning to appear, a time of chaos. Question?
Yeah, you said that you've only felt this way for 2 or 3 years. Like, what sparked that change, that shift?
Well, there was certainly, what sparked the change was the whole election year of 2016. Even if Hillary had won, it's clear that, so I've been writing about polarization and distrust for a long time. I started an organization called civilpolitics.org in 2007 because our polarization seemed to be running out of control, and it's gotten so much worse since then. If Trump had not come along, and again, I don't want to make any assumptions about your politics, but Trump is certainly a departure in terms of norms of civility. A lot of things have changed in 2016. So we saw some things, and then of course a political system requires some degree of trust. I shouldn't say never. Within historical memory, we have not tried to run a democracy with so little trust in each other or in institutions. Scandinavian democracies work quite well because they have trust in each other and in their institutions. We used to have that until the 1970s or 80s, and it's been declining since then. Thinking through the implications of social media, which we'll do in this talk, is the main reason I think this may not just be cyclical, that it may be a one-way street down. But the sense that things fall apart, the center cannot hold, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This is an amazing poem because normally poets celebrate passion and emotion. And here Yeats, having just gone through the First World War and with looming violence in Ireland, is noting that it's actually the moral passions that are blowing things apart in his world. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. All right, so now we are in the situation where lots of political scientists are writing books about what the end might look like and how the end comes to democracies. So that's the opening. Now, if you're not suitably depressed and anxious, let's talk about the basic moral psychology that has gotten us to this point. But if you understand it, then there might be ways out. I don't think there are ways out if we don't understand the psychology that these technologies and trends sort of tap into. So I'll just go over. So my book, The Righteous Mind, is based on 3 ideas. If you understand these 3 ideas, you understand moral psychology. So I'll just go through them very briefly, and then that'll be it. We'll stop at that point. So here's the book. The cover conveys the sense of a rip or a tear. This was designed in 2012. In the UK, they have a different publisher, a different art department. They came up with this cover, which I quite like, although it would have lost me some readers in the United States. This is the paperback in the U.S., which gets across the idea of demonization, good versus evil. So it's these 3 ideas. So let's do the first. In every great society, in every society that leaves us writing, there's the idea that the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. The Greek tradition gives us the idea that the human mind is like a charioteer trying to control 2 horses, the noble passions and the base passions. And if a man studies philosophy and learns to control himself and his passions, then he will escape this mortal coil. His soul will return to heaven afterwards. And so this is the ideal in Western philosophy of reason being in charge despite the difficulties of the passions. But as a psychologist, I early on came to believe that Plato was not only wrong about what we're like, he's actually wrong as an aspiration, that we cannot aspire to this, and that if we try, we don't get very far. I came to believe that David Hume was much more correct, a much better psychologist, when he wrote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." And so here we're coming to many of the things you've been talking about in this course. Reason, what we do when we are formulating arguments to give to each other, when we're writing, what we're doing, Hume says, is actually not, the metaphor of a servant or butler is actually not the best one. A better metaphor is a press secretary. The press secretary is the servant of the president. The press secretary is very, very smart. The press secretary is very, very skilled verbally. What is she doing with all this intellectual, with all this verbal firepower? What is she doing? Is she trying to explain to the people exactly why the president really made a decision? No. What is her job? What is she trying to do? What does the press secretary do? When she talks to the press, what does she?
Cover up.
Yeah. She's trying to find whatever words will work best to advance their strategic aims of the administration. There's a very dramatic illustration of this about 8 months ago, or earlier this year. This is, what's his name? Peter Navarro. So he says, "My function really as an economist is to try to provide the underlying analytics that confirm his intuition. And his intuition in these cases is always right." Now this is about raising tariffs. It's very, very hard to find an economist on this planet who believes that in general raising tariffs is a good idea. Trump found one who was willing to say it, but economic wisdom says that this is generally not true, but his job is not to tell the truth. His job is to justify. This, I think, is a very good metaphor for what our reasoning powers do. A simple formulation, and this should be very good in a class on critical thinking, very helpful. It comes from Tom Gilovich, a social psychologist. In general, the rule is this: if you want to believe something, there's some proposition that Obama was born in Kenya, or that the Republicans are destroying the country, whatever it is, whatever you want to believe, you start with either liking that proposition or disliking. If you like it, you want to believe it, what your mind is doing is not saying, what's the evidence? We're terrible at that. What your mind is doing is saying, can I believe it? Do I have permission to believe it? Let me find permission to believe it. Can I find one argument, one piece of evidence? If I can, I'm done. I can stop thinking. So I'll give you one example from a research study. Students are brought into the lab. They're in a psychology course. They come into the lab to do research, and they're given a paper. It looks like it was written in Science, and it shows a relationship between caffeine consumption and breast cancer. And your job in this study, you're learning psychology, you're learning experimental methods. What do you think of the study? How good are the methods? Who do you think finds a lot of flaws in that study? Call it out. Who's going to be really critical of the
Coffee drinking women?
Exactly. Coffee drinking women are the ones who are asking, must I believe it? I don't want to believe it. How big was the sample size? What were the motivations of the experimenters? They're desperately, because they're saying, must I believe it? Most other people are saying, they don't care either way. All right, fine. Caffeine causes breast cancer. Here's another example. You come into the lab and images are flashed up on a screen, and your job is, if you see anything that looks like a letter, you're supposed to press a button within 1 second. And so you're there at your desk and you're watching, and then what is it? That flashes up. What was that? Okay, so for half the people, they were paid if they see a letter, but half the people were paid if they see a number, and for them it was a 13. So nobody says it's a Q or an automobile. It's either a B or a 13. But if there's ambiguity, we see what we want to see. Now think about that. Think about this the next time you argue with a friend about anything, any ambiguous situation. There's always ambiguity. Even the question of whether the minimum wage helps or hurts the working poor. basic economic questions. There's at least some ambiguity in the data, and people see what they want to see. The more passionate we are, the more angry we are at each other, the more willing we are to believe crazy, crazy lies about the other side. Because we're not asking, is it true? We're asking, can I believe it? This has profound implications for liberal democracies. As passions rise on both sides, so does motivated reasoning, and this is why we are now in post-truth politics. It's not just because of the technology, it's because we really, really hate each other. And by we, I don't mean all of us. I mean the politically active minority on both sides, which are the ones that drive our politics. Those who are not so angry tend not to vote. Young people like yourselves tend not to vote. So you are essentially political dark matter. I don't mean that about all of you. I'm just kind of trying to spur people of your age to go vote. Secondly, a second implication, social media amplifies everything. It puts motivated reasoning on steroids, and this, again, is why we have fake news. It's not just it's the combination of the technology and the hatred. All of this leads to a trust spiral. Declining trust makes democracies throughout the world dysfunctional. We act as though a Supreme Court nomination is the most important thing in the world, as though our side will be destroyed if we don't get this nomination, because now that is actually true. 30 years ago that wasn't true, but now it is. Because we don't trust each other or the Supreme Court. There's been a strengthening of partisan affect. This is just a graph of how much Americans, what they think on a scale of 0 to 100. The top lines are the red and blue ratings of their own party, Democrats and Republicans. The bottom lines are cross-party ratings. So back in the 1980s, the cross-party ratings were actually only around 50. If you ask what Republicans think of the Democratic Party and vice versa, it was not positive, but it wasn't that negative. But it's gone down and down and down. It's now extremely negative. Whatever side you're on, you really dislike the other side. This is a very helpful paper that really explains how social media has changed the basic informational environment. So social media vastly increases our exposure to offensive stimuli. We now hear if somebody somewhere in America says something offensive, and there's 350 million of us, 100 of us say horrible, horrible things every single day, and now you get to hear them all on social media, often with video. So more exposure to more emotional stuff. The response is we can get more angry, but at the same time also it's possible that our emotions are deadened. The effort it takes to react is reduced almost to zero. You just click on something. There are no more physical constraints. You don't have to go someplace to hear this horrible news. Anyway, so there's a variety. This is a great paper by Molly. What's her name again? Molly at Yale. I'll think of it in a second. At any rate, if you just Google Molly Crockett. So it really lays out how this new technology changes sort of the economy of outrage. Yes?
Why do you have an upward arrow for personal benefits? What do you think?
Yeah, so the personal benefits to reacting, where is that here? Will you tell me, do you sometimes retweet or repost things?
Not often, no.
Okay. So raise your hand if you like every day you in some way forward or repost or retweet something. Raise your hand. Okay.
Only the true stuff.
Okay. Why do you do it? Why?
To like bring awareness to things, or just to show anyone that is interested or watching something that's interesting to me.
So you're just totally pro-socially motivated. You do this just to spread enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Do you ever think about what people think of you if you forward something?
No. Like not particularly.
Okay. Anyone else want to?
I do. I virtue signal every day.
Yeah. I mean, whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not, we care deeply about what people think about us. And if I can forward something, or if someone is being shamed and I pile on, to the extent that I get personal benefit from it, I will do so. So one feature of internet pile-on, one feature of mobs, so when professors or students are mobbed and there are petitions to have them fired and hundreds or thousands of people sign them, a lot of the people, maybe most, don't actually believe it. They're just doing it because it looked good, they're afraid not to. So the personal benefits, so we have these very, very cheap, just a click is all it takes to do something. It used to be you had to actually get up out of your chair, go someplace and risk physical violence if you were to get involved in a conflict. Now you just click and you get the credit. So that's the reason for the upward arrow. So again, I think this is how this has worked. It's made it very easy for us to be manipulated by political actors, as we saw in the Cambridge Analytica thing. The Russians figured out how to use our own passions against us. A big study in Science published a year ago concluded that, yes, Russian bots were very active in our election, but guess what? The spread of false information isn't primarily due to bots. False news speeds faster around Twitter due to people retweeting inaccurate news items. If there weren't the bots, we'd still have the same basic problem because basically we're all Russian bots now. So that's the point about intuitions come first. All right, so is that clear? Any questions about that? This is the basic argument about intuitionism. Yes?
Are you saying it has to be that way or that it is that way?
I'm saying this is human nature. There are ways, it's very hard as an individual. So first of all, there's variation. Some people are less emotional, more reasoned. We call these people libertarians. I actually have data on this, that libertarians are lower on emotion, higher on reasoning ability. They have worse relationships, they care about people less, but they're better able to just reason through a lot of data. So a lot of analysts are that. More broadly, if you go further that way, you have Asperger's or even autism. So there are variations among people, but what I'm most interested in is there are variations in systems. So there are some systems that correct for this problem. Can anyone think of a system that would correct for this problem? How could you put people together in a way that would cancel out this problem? What do you think?
To some extent, in a republic, you can have specifically educated people be the ones making the decisions.
So you mean we have a committee of wise men and women and trust them? Do you think that wise people are less prone to these problems?
No. And I think there's all kinds of problems that just come with being human that we would need to find a way to avoid. But in general, I think it could partly limit extremism.
The research that I cover the research in the book, people with high IQ are really, really good at post hoc reasoning. They're much better than people of average IQ. If you ask them to find reason on the other side, they're no better. So we use our IQ points not to find the truth, but to do a better job of justifying what we want to believe. So if you get a group of people who are super smart and who all share the same ideology, guess what? They will be extra confident that their ideological fantasy is going to work. So what's the solution? What could correct for that flaw? Dictatorship. I'm going to wait until you at least give me some ideas. What do you think?
Are we to put university basically being
How
exposed,
so?
being exposed to different ideas and understanding how people argue for those ideas and being able to refute them?
Bingo. Bingo. Keep going. So you have to be exposed to the ideas. You have to have viewpoint diversity. If everybody is spouting the same party line, you're wasting your time. You're just digging deeper into it. The only cure for the confirmation bias is other people who have a different confirmation bias. So a university where everyone's on the same side, which is most of our universities in the Northeast and along the West Coast. This one looks different. This one leans left, but that's great. What you don't want is one where everybody's on the left or right. It'd be the same thing on the right. So you have to be exposed to different ideas. And what else do you need? What norms do you need? What do you think in the back?
I was just thinking maybe you need to learn how to think critically.
Great. So being instructed in critical thinking skills would make this community much better. Great. And what norms would you want along with those critical thinking skills?
What do you mean by norms?
There are certain norms appropriate to a dinner party. There are norms appropriate to diplomacy. And there are norms appropriate to university. If your goal was to cancel out confirmation bias and help a community find the truth, what norms would you want? What do you think?
I think you need to use your ears and mouth proportionally by listening more than you speak.
Okay, good. Everybody should listen more, not just be out there. Although it could work if things were properly balanced. You could have a bunch of people shouting. It could conceive it, but you're right. It would work better if we all. Yeah, good. Okay. What else? What other norms? What else would you do?
Capacity for an open mind.
Capacity for an open mind, that's right. You want to really educate people about their biases, about how we cling to beliefs. So you want people to be open-minded, you want them to listen, you have to have viewpoint diversity. What else?
Tolerant or respectful.
Tolerant or respectful. Good. Does that just mean, hey, if you believe that, I'm not going to criticize you, I'm tolerant of you?
Just like keep it in rather than if you have an angry or...
Wait, keep what in?
Your contradiction, your...
Would that help? If we all, okay, you know what? If you hear something and you disagree with it, keep it in. Is that a good norm?
Well, that's what you're trying to eliminate.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the problem today on college campuses. Now, I don't think you have the problem here, but here's the question. When you're in a class discussion about any sort of political issue, any sort of controversial issue, and someone says something and you think differently, do you feel comfortable saying, I disagree, what about this? Do you feel perfectly comfortable disagreeing in a class? Or do you think, I better not say anything? Raise your hand if here at Chapman, in general, if someone says something that you disagree with, raise your hand if you just feel perfectly comfortable disagreeing. Raise your hand. Great. Raise your hand if you self-censor, if you think, better keep my mouth shut. Raise your hand. Okay. So this is actually great because at most schools, everybody raises their hand for self-censorship and almost nobody raises their hand for ability to speak up. And when I say most schools, I shouldn't say that. At the elite schools in the Northeast and the West Coast, that is typically the case. At schools in the South and in less politicized parts of the country, it's more the pattern that you guys have. But you get the idea. This is what I've shown you is my claim about what human nature is. It is perfectly suited for a tribal species dancing around the campfire, worshiping rocks and trees, and preparing for battle the next day against another group that worships different rocks and trees. That's human nature. Somehow we've created systems that rise above that. This is the genius of Western liberal democracy. British institutions in particular. British institutions are so much better than Spanish institutions. Thank God America was settled by the British, not the Spanish. So the British institutions, thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
But we have social media too.
And what?
We have social media too, so you're just implying that our system is able to cope better than yours in the face of social media.
No, that I'm not saying. I'm just saying, if we look back over the last 500 years, there were various approaches. Britain had one set of ideas, the French had a different, very centralized, dirigisme. I mean, the French are very different from the British. And the French model obviously works. France is a nice country, but overall, I think the British, anyway, that's another story. My point is just that. The British idea of governance and of courts, because remember, the French appoint a wise person to find the truth. I think that's a very bad idea. The British say you have to have a group of common people judging. And from what I hear from lawyers, the jury system works pretty well in general because they cancel out each other's confirmation biases. All right, so anyway, you get the point. Universities are amazing creations because they cancel out this problem. They're very precious. Many of them are malfunctioning. That will be the point of my talk tonight. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Let's see, what's our time? Okay, we're doing okay. So briefly, what my own research has been on, well, just the first two of these, I developed a theory called moral foundations theory. This is just to impress people who say there's no data in my talk. This is a multidimensional path analysis and all sorts of analyses about the relations among the foundations. But here's the idea. As I said, when I was in grad school and I read ethnographies and I saw how amazingly similar elements of morality are around the world, yet how different the final picture looks, I set out to look for what you might think of as the taste buds of the moral sense. We have 5 taste receptors. All human tongues can detect chemical properties of the world in these categories: sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and umami, or sort of protein or meat. There's a meat flavor. So our tongues detect 5. Our noses detect more, but there's 5 chemical properties of the world that our tongues evolved to detect because we evolved as creatures that eat fruit and meat, and that's what you need to detect proper fruit and meat. In the same way, what are our social receptors? What are the elements of social life that all humans or all human societies seem to be responsive to? And so that's what moral foundations theory is. It's a claim that there are 6, originally 5, but we think 6, or there's more than that, but there's 6 really big ones. So one is care or harm. We're mammals. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a mammal? At minimum, it means that we bear our young live, and then we nurse them with milk. So the female body is evolved for mammalian life, but amazingly, or not amazingly, kind of obviously, the brain is too. Now, in most species, the female brain is specialized for care. The male brain is completely indifferent. But in some species, not just us, but in some species where there is male investment, the caring circuits stay on. They're not erased in utero. They stay on, and men and women love and care for babies. And when we see a baby or a cute or helpless creature, even a cartoon creature, even a stuffed animal being tortured or ripped apart, we feel something. It's a horrible, horrible feeling. That's like a moral taste bud. Now, what I find in my own research is that while everybody has this capacity, political ideologies and worldviews on the left build a lot on it. These are photos I took at Occupy Wall Street. Compassion is our new currency. Let's get rid of money and just use love instead. So you would never, ever see signs like this at a right-wing rally. It just could not happen. So it's not that conservatives don't love their children and dogs, but they don't base their political philosophy and ideas on that kind of love. The second foundation is fairness and cheating. Everybody has it. Everybody cares a lot about fairness and cheating. Now, on the left, the idea, a clear, salient standard of fairness is equality. If there's inequality, there's unfairness. But on the right, they talk about it differently. On the right, they see fairness as proportionality. So this was a photo taken at a Tea Party rally. Stop punishing success, stop rewarding failure. What do you think that means? How does our society punish success, according to conservatives?
Taxes.
Taxes, that's right, that are not flat. So everyone's fine with, everyone's that of course the rich should pay more dollars, but shouldn't we all pay the same percentage? That's what some people on the right say. And so 9% flat tax, that guy, whatever, wanted to do, the pizza guy. But a proportional tax system is punishing the rich. How do we reward failure? How does America social welfare? Helping the poor. That's right. If people make mistakes, if they are foolish with their life, and then we have to bail them out, we're rewarding failure. So that is a certain view that's common on certain elements of the right. Is there a question in the back?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you said that you wouldn't see signs of emotional signs like free empathy and stuff like that at a right-wing event.
Yes.
But you said the right side is more emotional, and then that liberals towards the left are more towards reason. So why would it go the other way?
Did you read The Righteous Mind? Is that where you got that from? I didn't say that today, did I?
Yeah, you said
that the right is more emotional?
Yeah.
You mentioned that libertarians.
Yeah,
Oh,
you mentioned
yeah.
that
Libertarians are less emotional, but liberals, and it is true that on measures of emotionality, the left is a little more emotional than the right, but that difference is very small. Both groups are really different from libertarians. There are some people like George Lakoff have claimed, and I think he's right, that at least the way the American Democratic Party has approached elections is, let me explain to you how our policies will give you more money. And that's what Democrats did, especially Dukakis and Gore and Kerry, whereas Republicans were much better at saying, America is a shining city on a hill. And so it is true that Republicans are better at appealing to emotions. I don't know if that's true at left and right in general. I don't know if that's true in the UK, but that has been true in America. Okay, so moving on through these foundations. We all care about fairness, but we have different definitions, left and right. Third foundation, liberty and oppression. Everybody cares about that. But we see different elements as the bad guys. So this was the Great Seal of Virginia, and I lived there for 16 years, and it didn't occur to me at first to ask, why is there a dead guy on the flag? Like, why would you have a flag with like death and murder? Anyone know? What does that mean? Sic semper tyrannis.
And death to tyrants.
Death to tyrants. That's what the conspirators shouted when they murdered Julius Caesar for being a tyrant. And once you understand that this flag was created in like 1787 or 1778 or something like that, when the British citizens, they were not Americans, they were British citizens in North America, were rebelling against the British king. They were throwing over their own king. It was not some foreign king, it was their king. And they were overthrowing him. They were saying, no, we are breaking our allegiance to him. Why? Well, let's show you this document. Have you ever read the Declaration of Independence? It's a long list of grievances to justify that. So can I believe it? Can I believe that I'm entitled to overthrow this very deep bond of loyalty to a king? Well, let's all work together to construct justifications, and this is part of it. Anyway, the psychology of it.
By the way, that's what John Wilkes Booth yelled after he shot Lincoln.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So it's very deep in the American psyche that we don't like tyrants, we kill them. And so this idea is behind this iconography from Occupy Wall Street. If the 99% could get together, they could crush and kill the 1%, kill the rich. So on the left, people tend to see the rich and corporations as the oppressors. On the right, until it was different, it's different now, but certainly when Democrats are in power, or just in general historically, the right in America sees the government as the bully and oppressor, and so ideas of rebellion against the government are common. So anyway. Fourth foundation, loyalty betrayal. There are a number of species that are cooperative. They're all siblings. They're always close relatives. The only difference, the only one is us. We're able to do massive cooperation without kinship because we evolved this ability to do war. We're prepared for war, and it's only because we are prepared for war and we enjoy war. We enjoy thinking about war. We enjoy stories about war. So we made up team sports that are basically just fake war. And then we love fake war so much that we invented super fandom. People actually do all kinds of tribal things so that they can enjoy the fun of us versus them in a relatively harmless way. And I don't show it here, but there's evidence that people who are attracted to conservatives, not libertarians, they're the least like this, but conservatives are more groupish in this way. They enjoy team sports more. They enjoy these sorts of things more. Authority subversion, we're primates who show deference in similar ways across our genus or whatever that is. But on the left, there is, this is on the right. So this is a church near Charlottesville. God's in charge, so shut up. Now, it's a joke, but it's clear this is not a joke that Unitarians would make. This is going to be a more conservative denomination. Whereas on the left, and again, this is the far left, you have anarchists who say no gods, no country, no masters, to hell with the troops. So very deliberately saying, no, we do not value authority. The last foundation, sanctity degradation, ideas that the body's a temple. This especially governs ideas about female sexuality, also ideas about food. So this is an image of the Madonna from the 15th century, and this is the Madonna from the 1980s, from her book called Sex, rejecting this notion of chastity and purity. So on the left, there tends to be a rejection of this for sexuality, but the left does a lot of purity talk about food. The left really goes to town on, and go to a natural foods shop. There's a lot of talk about invisible essences. Nothing is sacred, or no thing is sacred. This is a photo at Occupy Wall Street. So to put it all together, I have a research site, yourmorals.org. You can go there and take our quizzes and score your own morals. What we find in general is that when people come to the site, they register, and people who say that they're very conservative actually give fairly high scores on all these foundations that I just showed you. But people are on the left are the most, they value care the most, more than anyone else, and they also value fairness and liberty, but they don't value authority, loyalty, and sanctity in general. At least they value it less. Question?
Comment. I remember last year in AP Go, we talked about how the political structure is based on freedom, order, equality, and the trade-offs between that. And I just wanted to know if you have heard of that or had anything.
Oh yes, no, that's very true. So fairness here is, these are questions about fairness as proportionality. And when you do that, the right values it more. And as you see, liberty, here it's economic liberty, the right values it more. Now, if I had questions about fairness as equality of outcomes, then there'd be a very steep line that way. The left values equality of outcomes. And if it was liberty, sexual liberty, then it would have been the left more. So there it depends on what it is. But I have a sign from somebody made a sign at Occupy Wall Street. I was like, I couldn't believe how perfect this was for the things I wanted to write. It said, equality now, liberty later. And this is like catnip for libertarians. They love this, because it's this is what we always feared about the left, is that they're, just like communists of throughout the 20th century. Equality now, we're going to kill people who are on top. We'll just literally kill them, which is what the Russians did and the Chinese did. So yes, I think that is very much a trade-off. And libertarians go extremely one way, communists go all the way the other way. Okay, so now implications for liberal democracies. Left and right build appeals on different moral foundations, and then they talk past each other. The left builds primarily on care and fairness as equality. The right builds on fairness as proportionality, but also loyalty, authority, and sanctity. These differences were very, very evident in Brexit. In fact, I would love to know from Sue what she thinks, whether the story I've told fits the sort of Labour versus Tories split. I'll just put this out and then I'll pass it to you. And so this leads to an endless division and misunderstanding on immigration, all these culture war issues. They all make sense if you just apply the moral foundations. Kneeling instead of saluting the flag. If you're on the left, that's a virtuous thing to do. If you're on the right, this is treason. And as we've gotten more and more polarized, just last thing to say on this, if you look at how far apart Americans are on a basket of 10 different policy items, like about race and immigration, things like that, what we see is that from 1994 to 2017, Americans are not coming apart. In general, the difference between men and women is small and has not changed. Men and women are not coming apart in their attitudes about cultural war issues. By education, it's a little bit more. The only one, so this religious attendance, you can see we used to not be far apart at all. That's gone up a fair amount. Recently, we are more divided by religious attendance. So gender is low and has not changed. Religious attendance is increasing. People who go to church are now different from people who don't go to church, but that is nothing compared to the difference between Republicans and Democrats. They used to be 15 points apart in the 90s. Now they're 36 points apart. So we are really coming apart by parties. So this is the concern I have about our democracy. This is a fault line. It's a major fault line. So, Sue, what's the story? Do you think this is just an American story, or does this make sense in Britain?
The way you laid out care versus the equality I think applies, but we've had such strange things going on until Corbyn appeared. I would say, unlike you, we've had left and right, which are a bit different, but let's say similar enough, coming so close that in the previous election, I think you couldn't really choose between the Conservatives and Labour. They were just so close, fighting over the middle ground. But unlike you, we have a lot of other parties. We've got the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats and various other things, so you can get out of it and vote for somebody else if you want to. Then suddenly along comes Jeremy Corbyn with serious left things that do fit your thing here, and is really changing everything. And I'm not a very political person. I don't understand how it's happening. I will just throw in one other thought. When David Cameron came to power as a Conservative, he said things like, we need to care more about well-being and happiness than GDP. And what happened within a few months, all that nice ideas were swept away, and we're back to GDP and only economy matters. And then he got thrown out, and now we've got Brexit, and goodness knows what's going to happen. I would say we're still relatively stable, but in terms of the left-right things, they're all over the place now.
Right. Okay, thanks. So it's a nice illustration of how the parties can move around quite a lot. Parties are trying to assemble coalitions of voters. And so my claim is not that the parties in every country will show this exactly, but there's a kind of an attractor, there's a kind of a central tendency for people with one personality to go one way or the other. Okay, yes?
I wanted to ask if you thought increasing the number of parties and having more parties with different values would help alleviate the problem.
I think it would, because the worst number of parties, by far, the worst number is one. Okay, that's terrible. You don't want one party. That always works out really, really badly. You could make a case that in China it's actually, but in the long history of things, it's worked out really, really badly for a lot of dead Chinese. The second worst number is two, because we are so tribal, we are so good at saying us versus them. American politics should be a positive-sum game. Politics should be a way in which we negotiate, and you don't get everything you want, I don't get everything I want, but you add it up and we get 130% overall. It should be positive-sum. It is now so negative-sum that if each side just thinks, if I can hurt them more than they hurt me, because there's only two parties, I win. And so we all lose. So yes, a two-party system is very subject to being to these problems. That's why I'm especially worried about the American system. A parliamentary system can handle it. Now, I don't understand the ins and outs of parliamentary systems. Some, like Italy, are incredibly unstable, and minor parties can get a lot of power. So I don't know how you handle all of that.
Proportional voting versus winner.
First past the post, is
yeah, first past the post, that's right. Sorry, I'm so jet lagged, aren't I? But that is classically said to be the main difference between us and Italy. So if it's proportional, you've always got close numbers, so you don't get one party going way ahead of the others.
okay.
Where you've got first past the post, so we have all these constituencies, and you vote in your constituency, and if, let's say, it's like 51 vote for this and 49 for the other, that one gets in. So it exacerbates the differences and makes them much stronger.
But at least you get a governing. You get governance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't have
You-
the instability,
yeah.
but we do have. It does mean that the smaller parties remain very weak,
Right.
and
Okay.
they're always calling for proportional representation.
Right. Of course. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, doesn't that mean like some groups will not actually get, like, no one group will have a majority of the vote, like you'll always just have like more than other groups, if that makes sense? Like if you have like
Yeah.
four parties and you're competing for 100% of the vote.
Mhm. Yeah, there's no way. That's right. There's no way to do everything that you want. That you would want to have a fair system in which everyone has some sort of an equal voice or at least equal proportion. So, but what Britain has, which I think is very good, is what is called responsible party government. That means one party wins the election, they then get to rule, and then a few years later, the people can see: do we like how things are going, or don't we? And if we don't like it, we throw them out. In America, we have no idea who to blame. Things go badly, who's at fault? The president or the one party controls one? We don't know who to blame. So ours is kind of a mess with no good feedback loops. Now, it at least slows down action. In Britain, the ruling party can do a lot can really do a lot more than they can here generally.
Particularly the budget. They just set the budget. That's it.
Yeah.
Happens. This
Yeah.
one man does
Yeah.
does it.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. As Osborne or whoever it was.
Yeah. He writes it in this special case, and he spends months deciding what the budget's going to be, and then he announces it on budget day, and that's it.
And
There's no argument about it.
But
just does
he's
it.
responsible for it. In other words,
Oh, yes.
people. Okay, so that could be good. Our budget is a complete mess in which people just keep throwing stuff in, and nobody's responsible. Yes.
I wanted to ask too, because like America has other parties, but they
Not
have
really.
nowhere
Yeah.
near as much influence, of course.
They have
But-
they have zero influence.
Yeah.
What influence do they have?
But I was wondering, like, why you think that's the case, and also how we could change that to bring some of the smaller parties.
Yeah,
more into the
I don't know much about it. There's a wonderful book called The Parties versus the People by Mickey Edwards, who's a former Republican congressman. He argues that the two parties have a duopoly. So the Founding Fathers did not contemplate parties. Even when they were writing the Constitution, they didn't like parties. Of course, parties emerged immediately. One party favored the Constitution, one didn't, and and we're off to the races. But our system was not made for parties. It was made for each branch to check the other. And that's why we're in such a disastrous state right now. Because the Supreme Court, it's now clear, is not going to check the president if the president is of the Supreme Court's dominant party. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so alarmed about the future of our country. Okay, other questions on this or comments? Okay, yes.
So where do you personally stand between left, right, or what is your...
Mm-hmm. It's a reasonable question. I was always on the left, and that's why I started doing this work. I studied how countries differed, and after the Democrats lost 2 elections in a row that I thought they should have won in 2000 and 2004, and I heard Democratic candidates saying stupid things, just like, have you no idea how to talk to Americans about morality? I can help you. So I started writing memos, and nobody read them, and I set out, I said, you know what, I'm going to study this like an anthropologist would. I'm going to try to understand conservative morality. And it was in order to help the Democrats win. And it's a shameful thing that that's an appropriate thing for professors to do in this country, to just use their work to help one side. But that's what I did. And in the process of reading conservative writing and subscribing to National Review, it was wonderful to read National Review and The New Republic back when that was a good magazine, because they're both really smart, great writing. And then you read, you say, wow, there really is another side to this. I didn't know that. And having experienced that over and over again and realizing, wow, you actually do need to listen to people with different perspectives in order to understand something. I ended up stepping out and saying, I'm not on any team anymore. So I don't help any team. I am, by disposition and by social position more on the left. But I think center-right has a better grasp of human nature. If there's one book I recommend to you to understand what's going on here, the deep structure of politics and society, it's Thomas Sowell's book, A Conflict of Visions, the difference between the constrained vision of human nature and the unconstrained. I'll just stop there, but that's a brilliant, brilliant book. I really recommend that. I do think the two parties are in different states of health. I think the Democratic Party has problems, but the Republican Party has completely lost its mind. And I cannot believe the things that they are accepting. And they used to be the party of fiscal discipline. We badly need fiscal discipline, and they are now, since the 90s, they've been the worst. So I'm not indifferent between the parties, and I don't just sort of stand outside and say, oh, whatever. I'm very concerned. I think the Republicans are the biggest problem in Washington, but certain portions of the left are the biggest problem on campus. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. There are certain ideas promoted by elements of the left. Everybody's on the left on campus, in the faculty administration, practically. Not the students, but across there's just a study that just came out of administrators. Administrators are even more to the left than the faculty. So everyone's on the left. It's just a question of splits within the left. And I think, as I'll say tonight, there's some real problems that are damaging your education.
Actually, when we first met, I think, is when you wrote an essay, "Why People Vote Republican."
What makes people vote Republican?
This was I think it was a Brockman essay.
That's right.
Which I kind of objected to, because it's like it sounds like, why do people get cancer, or why do people do stupid things, as if a Republican
was
that.
a subversive marketing strategy to get people on the left to read it.
Yeah, well, it worked. Not that I'm on the left. I'm more libertarian, so. And that's the problem with libertarians, is we hate big organized political parties, so we'll never be a big organized political party. Libertarians are still striving for the day when they get 1%, which is worthless. You're a libertarian, okay? I've started calling myself a classical liberal now, because you get the cred with the liberal in the name, and it sounds with a little gravitas classical. It sounds like Greek or something like this. Anyway. Okay, so I know I haven't seen your analogy you used with the fine-tuning of the universe. That's brilliant, because I start the moral arc with the Enlightenment, and really the scientific revolution, and the discovery that we can understand the economy, the political system.
How intoxicating that was, that discovery.
Yeah. But the idea it's that there are rules we can discover through science of how we should and ought to act. So now I'm going to kind of slide into this across this wall you're not supposed to breach, which is between is and ought. So Hume famously said you can't derive an ought from an is. Just because animals enslave each other doesn't mean we should have slavery, something like that. But on the other hand, if there are certain ways that are truly better to live, like liberal democracies are better than theocracies and dictatorships, and market economies are better than command economies, and we discover that through experiment, can't we say science has told us we ought to live in a liberal democracy instead of a dictatorship?
So first, the intoxicating discovery that we can discover the laws of nature and the motion of the planets led instantly, as far as I can tell, or at least by the 18th century, to a variety of projects to discover the laws of morality and laws of social science. And people are different from the material world. We're not as law-like. And so those projects have always failed. They've always been undertaken by people who are high systemizers, who are hoping to do a physics of society.
Yeah.
It cannot be done. It will never be done. So that's the first point. The second point on how you can't derive an ought from an is, that has been taken way too literally. You cannot derive an ought from an is in the way that Hume just said. That is, we cannot say because animals do X, therefore we should do X. That makes no sense.
Right.
But I would say, as someone who studies morality, that the only possible way to derive an ought is from an is. Because morals are... let me give you the most useful distinction in the philosophical literature, I believe, for moral psychology. I should be careful with an actual philosopher in the room, but between there are anthropocentric truths and there are non-anthropocentric truths. So it is true that Earth is the third planet from the sun and that gold is a better conductor of electricity than aluminum. Those were true before humans ever evolved, and those will be true long after we're gone, and those are true on other planets. Well, whatever, if they come here, they'd see the Earth. So Sam Harris wants to argue, or did argue in the moral landscape, that moral truths are like the truths of physics or chemistry, that they are non-anthropocentric truths. And that was a big point of disagreement between us. I think there are multiple kinds of truths. Many people seem to think either it's true like physics or it's just subjective, like I like chocolate more than vanilla. And those are your choices. Which one is morality? Either you're a moral realist or you're a relativist, and that's it. I strongly disagree. I think that moral truths are anthropocentric truths, like the truths of the market. So here's a question for you. Is gold more valuable than silver? Raise your hand if you think that that's true. Is gold more valuable than silver? Raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Those of you with your hand up, you're right. Those of you with your hand down, you are so committed to relativism that you're afraid to say that gold's more valuable than silver. The market makes gold more valuable than silver. That wasn't true before humans evolved, and that won't be true after we're gone. But when you put us in interaction, that becomes true. Let's think about rights. Should women have equal political rights in society? Yes or no? Raise your hand if you think yes. Okay. Is that just your opinion, or is there a sense in which you can say that it is a truth? It is a truth that women should have equal political rights. Raise your hand if you think there's some truth to that statement. Raise your hand. Okay. Now, was that true throughout our evolutionary history? Let's go back 100,000 years, or 10,000 years, when there's a division of labor in which the politics and warfare and stuff is the male domain, and they do hunting, and the gathering is the female domain. Were they all wrong? Was every human grouping sexist, and they should have changed? They should have had, politics should have been equally, no, because the way that they lived then, of course you can say there was dominating. I'm not saying that they all was fine. I'm just saying the rights of women now is not a non-anthropocentric truth. It's an anthropocentric truth. And the way we live now, there is no defense. There is no way to justify not giving women equal political rights. But you can imagine human societies in which it's perfectly plausible to have a gender division of labor. Anyways, that's my view.
Yeah, but that's a little bit like saying before there was gold and silver on Earth, you couldn't say that one's more valuable than the other. Well, of course, you have to have the system in place. So once the system's in place, can we not discover moral truths through science and say it's better for women to have the vote than not have the vote in this particular system, and we can discover that as a moral realist truth?
Well, again, you're going down the Sam Harris road of saying, let's take human welfare and happiness as the criterion. Yes. And yes, we can use science to discover which systems lead to more welfare and happiness. And I think that is very relevant, but I don't think it's the whole story. And that's the debate between utilitarians and deontologists.
Yeah, but I would say that how do we discover that people would prefer to be healthy than sick, happy than depressed, wealthy than poor? You just ask them.
That's one way.
And in a way, asking, would you prefer to be enslaved or free? And they give you your answer. That's kind of a discovering that gold is better than silver in that particular system. It's a kind of moral truth.
So there
maybe truth is too big a word.
As a first approximation, that's not a bad way to start. I think that should always be part of the story. People systematically make certain choices. So, for example, people tend to choose more liberty rather than less, but there are ways in which there are traps. We deprive ourselves of the happiness that can come from commitments.
Yeah.
So there are certain ways in which we can still go wrong if you take that utilitarian approach.
Okay, now to contradict myself and my libertarian propensities of, like other cultures think that forcing women to wear the burqa or even female genital mutilation, that should be none of our business because that's their culture, those are their values, and who are we to go over there and force our values on them? On the other hand, I feel very strongly that these are morally unacceptable things, and we should do something to help the people that are being oppressed that way.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
No, so I used to think a lot about this, and I never really wrote up an article on it, but I think there's like a 3-part test that you can go through. So the first, whenever we see a practice that offends us, the first question we should ask is it, do the people who seem to be, no, let's start this way. First, is the practice clearly and explicitly justified by reference to moral goods that we can at least understand, even if they're not ours? So this is like the Isaiah Berlin pluralism. Right. And so the veiling of women in Islamic society is justified in that way, whereas chattel slavery is just, it's not, I mean, they made up some post hoc nonsense, but clearly that was just brute exploitation. So first, does a practice pass that first test, where it is part of a moral fabric that we can at least understand if we're at least slightly anthropologically sensitive? And veiling does pass that test. The second test is, do the apparent victims believe that they're victims, or do they defend it too? And if the apparent victims say, yes, I hate this and I'm going to try to escape, well, we're done. It's a bad practice. It should change.
Right.
Not if one or two, but if some percentage, if it's common for women to run from this practice.
Right.
And then the third is, there still is the possibility of false consciousness or brainwashing. And so there I would say, how resistant is that belief to exposure to other ways? So while many women might accept certain forms that we think are oppressive because they don't know any different, they've been raised that way, it's all they know.
Right.
But if you have women from that society who then travel to the West, live in the West, see how we live, and still say, my God, what you do is terrible, then I would say, even if it offends us, we have to accept it. So that's my 3-step test.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because I was conflicted about, for a long time, about polygamy and prostitution and drugs. From the libertarian perspective, consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want. These are, victimless crimes, so why not legalize them? But on the other hand, when you start reading about prostitution and polygamy, these are often teenage girls, or they start them off very young. They're not autonomous, rational beings that can make rational choices. So there, don't we need laws? And I think, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And those, especially when you have, I don't really know the ethnography, but it seems as though, from what little I know of such societies, you have a bunch of lascivious old men lusting after 13-year-old girls. On its face, it doesn't seem like some great virtuous thing that they're doing.
Right.
So yeah, that's going to fail pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you watch those Sister Wives shows, you wouldn't want to do this anyway. It's just insane. On the diversity issue, just a couple of current events. The Steve Bannon was deplatformed from the New Yorker festival because of their fans objecting to having an alleged right-wing nutball on there and giving him a platform. But on the other hand, he's one of the most influential people in the world today, since he was the sort of voice behind Trump's campaign policies. Would you invite someone like Steve Bannon to New York University and risk giving him a platform versus having a diversity of opinion?
So you have to look, I think it's very helpful to think about the telos of any institution or organization. What is its purpose? And the New Yorker is a left-wing literary magazine. That's what it is. And so it's not essential to its mission that it interview Steve Bannon. I think they probably made a mistake in inviting him. Once they invited him, I think they probably should have stuck it out, but I can't really blame them. The Economist is very different. The Economist is not a left-wing literary magazine. It is a liberal, classical liberal news magazine. So it is incredibly mission consistent. They write about populism and immigration. They are opposed to Bannon, so it is virtuous for them to bring a critic. That's part of the liberal tradition. For the Economist to do it was very consistent with their telos. I approve of the Economist for doing it. Coincidentally, I just started watching this morning. I'm only 15 minutes into it. I just started watching it, and man, Bannon is pretty persuasive. And I think that I haven't seen the end of it, but I think this probably is regarded as a win for Bannon, that interview.
I don't know. I saw him on Bill Maher last 2 weeks ago.
Oh, Bill Maher had Bannon on?
He did.
Wow.
And Bill was ready to destroy him, and he didn't.
He didn't, yeah,
no,
that's right.
Bannon's pretty sharp.
Yeah. So you have to judge. My fear, and this is again one reason I'm very pessimistic, is that every practice, every institution's its own way of being excellent or poor, ever bad. And a really good restaurant should serve people really well and serve them really good food. A really good doctor should heal. Every institution has its own telos. What's happening now with social media and our intensifying culture war is everything is increasingly has the same telos, which is fight the other side. And so if you go to a university, increasingly, especially in the Northeast or along the West Coast, it's not about finding truth. It's about fighting conservatives and fighting the right and fighting fascism and fighting racism. And that's the purpose of scholarship, is to fight the other side. Truth be damned. So I will not let my kids go to school in New England, for example. There's not a single school in New England that I will let them apply to.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know the one.
Well,
Chicago, Princeton's okay.
Yeah.
There
Chapman?
are some schools. Chapman.
Yeah.
I would actually let them apply to Chapman. Because as many of you said, you're actually willing to speak up in class. In many of our top elite schools in the Northeast, they're not.
So this week, the Harvard lawsuit by a group of Asian students suing them for discrimination because they have to score something like 250 points higher on their SATs to get in versus other racial groups. And I kind of see both positions. It should be a meritocracy. But on the other hand, if you want diversity of culture and viewpoints, you have to, reach to other categories of people, although I hate cataloging people by race or whatever, but we still do that.
Yeah.
What is your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is a fascinating case. So the first principle is, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Affirmative action, the way we do it, it can be done well. The Army did it well. The Army had terrible race problems, and they committed to not using different standards, but to making differential investments to try to get black soldiers and up through the ranks, more qualified. So it can be done well. What we do in the academic world is incredibly dishonest, and Harvard is basically getting nailed for that. So in general, I am very unsympathetic to what Harvard is doing, and I'm enjoying the fact that they're being humiliated and embarrassed and caught in lies. On the other hand, there is a very serious issue here about test prep. What I mean is, so I spent 3 months traveling across Asia to do research for my next book. And what I discovered is that in Korea especially, but it's also in China and it used to be more in Japan, in East Asian countries, in Confucian countries, and it's also in South Asia, but especially in Confucian countries, they have a long history of civil service exams, they have a long history of tests, they have a long history of test prep. So in Korea, kids do not have a childhood. They are caught in what's the word, not a race to the bottom, what's it?
An arms race?
An arms race. They're caught in an arms race. So they spend their entire childhood preparing for a test. You go to Korea, everybody speaks English, but very few people speak it well, even though they've studied since they were aged 4. And the reason is because in Korea, it's not a language, it's a subject on the test. So they waste huge numbers of hours preparing for a test. East Asian immigrants, so I live in New York City, my kids go to public school. My kid is one of the few half Asian kids in this competitive school. Almost everybody's Chinese, because the Chinese in America, now God bless them, they come poor. It is a meritocracy. They work hard. They're smart. They have families. So, of course, they should be disproportionately represented because they deserve it. But at the same time, the culture of test prep is such that their childhoods are sacrificed, and ultimately it is not fair. So I do not think we should just go by test scores. As long as we have cultural differences in the willingness of different ethnicities to sacrifice childhood to test prep, we cannot just go by the test.
Right. So that's kind of related to social support, welfare, Head Start programs, and so on. With so many, say, single moms bringing up kids in poor communities, they're not going to be able to score as high on SATs for a whole variety of reasons that are not related to genetics. That I think we can all agree has some effect. Don't we have a moral obligation to allocate at least some of our budget, or maybe 20% of our GDP, which is about the average for Western countries, to helping people to get them up, so it's not just a meritocracy where you have this 1% really end up owning 90% of the wealth and power?
Yes, I think we do have a moral obligation to do it. I think that's the right way to do it, and that's the way that the Army did it. There's a wonderful book, Dream Hoarders, by Richard Reeves, about the things that most of us in the top 10% do to get our kids into these competitive schools and get them on the conveyor belt up to the top. One of the worst things we do in this country is we fund our schools by local taxes. So there's a lot in this country that works against kids born to poor families, to single parents. I think affirmative action done where you just take people and you put them in sets them up for failure and reifies stereotypes because people see visible differences between groups. That's terrible. That's counterproductive. But to make a national commitment to spend a lot more to educate, to lift up the bottom. So, for example, in New York City, where Mayor de Blasio is trying to change the tests to get more racial diversity, I think the clearest thing that we should do is use city money, taxpayer money, to have massive test prep, especially in the poorest schools. Those kids should get free test prep if we're going to use a test.
Do you have an opinion on universal basic income to replace welfare? And
It's an empirical question. I expect that it will be a disaster in America, even if it works in Finland.
if you don't know what this is basically give everybody $1,000 a month. And that the people that are unemployed or being replaced by artificial intelligent robots and so on, they'll at least have a basic income to survive. Yeah. But you have to get rid of welfare and so on.
Right. So because it seems to work in Finland or a few other places where it's been tried, in a country in which it is shameful to not work, in a country where it's a small country with very strong norms and shame for people who don't work, a UBI could work wonders. In our country, I don't think it will work. And as video games get better and better, young men spend more and more time on them. And as pornography becomes three-dimensional and tactile, I think we're going to lose all of our young men. I just did it at Mocha. Well, that's coming. I mean, that's the.
I know. Our first AI robots are going to be sex bots. Oh my God.
Yeah.
We're just apes.
Yeah. So I think UBI here. So men have been dropping out of the labor force as women rise.
Right.
I think if we have UBI and there's no shame to